Welcome to, I guess it's the week 5 episode of the Critical and Cultural Theory Lecture Series. My name is Eirik Steinhoff, and I'm an adjunct member of the faculty here at Evergreen, and this school year I've been co-curating the lecture series with Miranda Mellis. It's a great honor to welcome Roy Scranton to campus today, and I should mention straight away that Professor Scranton will be speaking again on campus this evening at 5:30 in the Longhouse for the Liberal Arts Forum that's been organized by Evening and Weekend Studies. I should also say that this event wouldn't be possible without the very deep support from Evening and Weekend Studies, in particular Dean George Freeman and his assistant Tricia Bateman have made this event possible. And I think, George, are you here?
Yeah.
Oh, so George is in back. All right, thank you, George.
You might be all come this evening if you don't get enough of Roy this morning. I need another hit of that man. You come tonight, 5:30 to 8:30 is our work time. Probably the same as you. We'll be actually using our time to do a seminar. So we have a set of questions that have been proposed by the Evening Weekend Studies faculty. And so after Roy's presentation, there'll be an opportunity for the students to seminar. If you've never experienced any of the students from Evening Weekend Studies, I recommend that you come on tonight and see what a great community we have. So thank you, Ira, for letting me do my plug.
Sure thing. If you've got a friend who couldn't make it this morning, maybe you could send them along this evening. I know there's busy schedules out there. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to say a few words about this lecture series. This is a way of reminding ourselves what it is that we're doing, and it's also an opportunity to introduce ourselves to our guest. The Critical and Cultural Theory Lecture Series brings different programs together on alternating Wednesdays to discuss keywords, key concepts, or key figures in contemporary theory. It's a chance for us to build a common vocabulary beyond the horizons of our individual programs, in conversation with thinkers of our present moment. Now comes my favorite part of these introductions, and it's where I take attendance. And we're going to do this as efficiently as possible. I'm going to say the name of the program that you're in, and when I say that, if you can just raise your hand. This is a way for us to get a chance to see who exactly is in the room. So we've got 20th and 21st century European philosophy taught by Joe Tugis. You guys are here, great. Also here are students in Impossible Objects taught by Miranda Mellis, excellent. The Philosophy of Technology taught by Alejandro de Acosta. And then Politics and Aesthetics co-taught by me and Steve Niva and Heidi Boysen. Great. Thanks.
Nature and Culture of Natural History.
And Nature and Culture of Natural History is also materialized. Show us who you are. Nice. Is there anybody else that wishes to be introduced in aggregate? Are there any isolatos that wish to be introduced? All right. So who else is here? Based on our reading for today, you already know that Roy Scranton is the author of 2 provocative essays published in the New York Times, Learning How to Die in the Anthropocene and We're Doomed, Now What? The first of these was expanded into a book that came out in 2015, and I understand that the second has expanded into a collection of essays on climate change and war that will be coming out later this year. He's the author of a highly acclaimed novel called War Porn, which was published in 2016, and he's written a wide array of pieces that have appeared in a wide array of journals, such as The Nation and Rolling Stone on the one hand, as well as scholarly journals such as Contemporary Literature and Theory and Event. Professor Scranton is originally from the Pacific Northwest. He grew up in Oregon. I learned a little while ago that he's actually lived in Olympia. Between 2002 and 2006, he served in the US Army, which, as you know from today's reading, took him to Baghdad and New Orleans, as well as other places. He received his BA and then his MA at the New School for Social Research, and then went on to a PhD in English from Princeton University. He now teaches creative writing at the University of Notre Dame. So all of this is just to say, Roy Scranton is a busy guy, and he gets things done. He's also a rare hybrid, both soldier and scholar. But I should also say, that's not such a rare hybrid on this campus, where there's lots of veterans who are also students. He's especially well suited as a speaker for our series for a number of reasons. For one thing, he reminds us, or perhaps shows us in the first place, what the role of the writer and thinker is, or could be, in the space and time of crisis. For another thing, he draws our attention to the value of the liberal arts and humanities as a reservoir and repertoire of ways of responding to the chaos and damage we face as our civilization continues to consume fossil fuels at a psychotic velocity. I know there are many in the room this morning who've been reading Hannah Arendt and the introduction to the human condition, responding in particular to the imminent threat of nuclear holocaust. And she was writing in the late 1950s. Arendt invites her readers, as she puts it, to think what we are doing, to theorize our practice, we might say. I think of Roy Scranton as operating in this tradition. He wants us to theorize our practice, to make our doing visible to ourselves. But in addition to thinking what we are doing, he asks us to think what we are not doing, to theorize and reflect on the ways in which we have failed to respond to what's right in front of us. And he gives us the tools to think a difficult thought, to think that we are done. We're doomed, he observes, and then without missing a beat asks, now what? For this service, I think we'll be forever in his debt, not least since it means we're not alone in making our attempts to think and do and be otherwise. His topic for today is a question: what is thinking good for? Please join me in welcoming Roy Scranton back to Olympia.
Thank you, Eric, for the introduction, for bringing me here, for making this possible, and thanks also to George Freeman, Patricia Bateman, and the Evening and Weekend Studies program for bringing me here to Evergreen and back to Olympia. It's great to be back here. There's a lot of memories for me in Olympia and the Puget Sound area. I dropped out of college at the University of Puget Sound many years ago. I lived here for a summer, sort of 1999, 98, 99, I don't remember, working for Washburg on a campaign to stop an oil pipeline across the Olympic Mountains. And then I was back later in 99 in Seattle for the WTO protests that year. It always feels like home to come back to the gloomy skies and great green trees of this region, and especially when I see the highway exit for Slater Kenny, like my heart just skips a beat. So it's great to be back here. I'm going to talk for probably about half an hour-ish, and then we'll move into questions, answers, and not answers, and a conversation really is the hope. I'm really, for a variety of reasons, hoping that we can really open this up into a discussion. One last thing, I guess, two last things before I begin. One, that this talk is different from the one I'll be giving this evening. As has been sort of advertised, if you didn't get enough here, do come tonight. that one's sort of more focused directly on the question of climate change. This talk is more about, is a more meta reflection on reflection in this moment of crisis, as Eirik was talking about. And the other thing is that I realized looking at some of the notes that Eirik had sent me that you began this semester with thinking about what is critique, and talking about, and so you've talked about Kant and Foucault, and I guess you're reading Arendt now. For my money, there are few thinkers as relevant to our current moment as Arendt, sort of in trying to work through the big picture. So it's very exciting, and I'm really delighted to be able to talk with you. I hope I'm not repeating things you've already done, but rather maybe opening up new avenues of discussion. So with that, I'll move my water around here, my coffee. I'll just start with what is thinking good for. Spend a couple of hours online skimming think pieces and hot takes, bouncing from Slate to the New York Times, to Twitter, to the Chronicle of Higher Education, to Reddit, and you'll soon find yourself either nauseated by the vertigo that comes of drifting awash in endless waves of repetitive, clickbaity, amnesiac dreck, or so benumbed and bedazzled by the sheer volume of AirSat's cognition on display that you wind up giving in to the flow and welcoming your own stupefaction as a kind of relief. Nevertheless, one can, out there among the hired trolls, scumslingers, professional identitarians, pundits, and charlatans, still reliably find good work, courageous, investigative journalism, thoughtful, witty, and erudite reflections on complex cultural phenomena, heartfelt, perceptive essays exploring intricate ethical and social dilemmas. Each piece, the assiduously hewn product of countless hours of labor, and all of it eminently disposable, fated to be consumed and retweeted and referred to for a few weeks, then forgotten. Like everything else, passing through the self-devouring gullet of our Ourobozian media leviathan, the beast we live within, picked up and dropped as we keep searching for newer confirmations of our half-articulated hopes and fears. More recent pictures to prove to us our world makes sense. Fresher flags to wave, telling other people who we are and that we exist. The internet's total instrumentalization of thought, in which every shared news item, hashtag must read, and essay is remediated to accessorize an online persona, has created a constant demand for new content, a great vortex sucking every half-formed attitude and clever tweak into its gaping maw, which is also its anus, spewing and eating and spewing again in an interminable grotesque mockery of public intellectual life, Hegel's world spirit as human centipede. Thanks. Flee from the trash fire of the agora to the fluorescent lit labyrinths of the ivory tower, and you find yourselves in another world, yet a recognizable one, in which the same faddishness and basic disposability hold sway as in the broader culture, but wrought in strange tongues and played out for much smaller audiences. Despite the vestigial guild system regulating entry into the academy, Sturgeon's law, which proposes that 90% of everything is crap, still holds, and thought is as instrumentalized in the university as it is out there in the marketplace. Articles and books are mainly valued not for their wisdom, aesthetic qualities, rigor, or information they hold about the world, though the sciences do still value empirical discoveries and the humanities still have some respect for archival research, but rather as entries on a CV, points toward promotion, testimony to the university's glory, and provocations for further knowledge production. On the humanities side, at least, since that's what I'm most familiar with, specifically literature and English, what one finds is a conversation driven primarily by relentless self-absorption, desperate for groundbreaking research agendas, neologisms, and epistemic revolutions, since these are the easiest ways for new scholars to distinguish themselves and for older scholars to stay excited about their profession. Each new crop of PhD students confronts a brutally competitive job market in which the individual odds for making a good career out of their long and arduous training are slim. Thus, the intellectual freedom and sense of discovery that may have been what drew them to graduate school in the first place are displaced by powerful compulsions to produce consumer objects a la mode, conventional enough to be recognizable, different enough to be interesting, shaped to the needs of the market, and ultimately disposable. Across the spectrum of cultural production, the same phenomenon holds. Our attention to any particular object of human thought or passion is fleeting. As soon as we start reading one article, we know that 6 more wait to replace it, and more behind those. More books, more series, more movies, more reviews, more lists. Our relationship with the objects of human intellectual and artistic production is no longer characterized by sustained attention and reflection, but rather swift and relentless consumption. Absorb as much as you can in a skim, post or repost on social media, move on. You're probably wondering right now how long I'm going to keep going on. Maybe, can you skip ahead? When am I going to get to the short quip that you can tweet to your followers? The important thing is not the object or its effect on us, but rather what stance or opinion the object makes possible. In this way, what we once recognized as thought, facilitated in literate culture by the circulation of texts, has become something else. On the one side, a shifting array of reactions and poses. On the other, a virtual hive mind. The individual thinker, like the individual artist, has been subsumed into the relentless and sterile abundance of consumer capitalism, having become in the process either a pop idol whose output is nothing but variations on a brand, or just another worker bee. The point here is not to lament the loss of the individual, nor to speak ill of pop idols, heaven forfend. Though the anthropological implications of the way that the internet and mass society are transforming our conception of the individual and evacuating that interiority, which is the sine qua non of the literate self, are profound and still not yet fully articulated. But rather to ask what it all means for thought. What does it mean today to think? What is thinking good for? It sometimes seems as if the only socially valued forms of intellectual labor are the production of ideology, you work in a think tank, the production of attention, you write think pieces, and the production of reproducible consumer objects, i.e. books, ideally ones with simple arguments that can be replicated endlessly with minor variations. I'm not talking about Steven Pinker or people like that, of course. Malcolm Gladwell, no. Producing actual knowledge about the world is still compensated, though not as well as producing opinions. And when it comes to thought, the situation seems bleak. Yes, critical thought is still spoken of as a value in the humanities wing of the education industry, even if critique has, by and large, devolved into a set of rote gestures. But the arduous liberation of consciousness from dogma and self-imposed ignorance is as unwelcome today as it was in Socrates' Athens. And even if you do find some solid journalism, beautiful writing, profound analysis, or edifying thought, what do you do with it? Read it, tweet it, then move on to the next, and the next, and the next? A stream of language passes into you through a screen, then back out through another screen. And can you truly say it even touched you? Were you even there? Or was it just a momentary shudder of the hive? Now that we're here, though, I see I've begun in media res, or rather in media, begging the question before I've even asked it. Before we can ask what thought means today, that is, we should probably ask what we mean by thought. Is it the same as critique, in a sense Kantian or Marxian or otherwise? Is it the love of wisdom, learning to die, the sedulous apprehension of universal abstract forms of truth, the elaboration of mental architecture justifying otherwise meaningless lives, a game we play? The answer is not immediately clear, though we might make some intuitive claims. We can be certain that thought has something to do with consciousness, and yet again something to do with language, though what exactly the relation is in each case is not entirely transparent. Thought has its pre-conscious insight, its structures and images, its relations and systems. Half the difficulty in thinking is putting thought into words. All the same, thought is not reducible to language, much less to text. The argument Socrates makes against writing in Plato's Phaedrus, that writing isn't properly philosophical because it always gives up the same answers to whoever questions it, suggests a way of approaching the question that sees thought not in terms of its product, the philosophical argument, or the artistic work, but as a process, a dialectic. And considered from this angle, perhaps, my initial concern over our relentless inattention to textual objects is misplaced. Thought, after all, does not inhere in ink and paper, much less in pixels on screens, but in the human social world, in situations just like this one. Yet the Phaedrus offers a paradox, because it itself is a text, and as Derrida demonstrates in his famous essay on Plato's Pharmakon, an ambiguous and dialectical text, as might be, so Derrida argues, all texts, since any text is not a dead letter at all, not some frozen thing transmitting pure truth, but a medium, and a medium not only connecting the present reader and absent writer, but connecting the thinking writer and language, logos, thought as social media, both in the writer's time, now long past in the case of Plato, and in the reader's. Thought is indubitably a social activity, though the archetypical image of the thinker as hermit would suggest otherwise. In the apartness of the eremite image, whether it takes the form of Socrates standing ruminating in his sandals, Siddhartha sitting under the lotus tree, Rodin's bent thinker perched pondering the gates of hell, or Hannah Arendt smoking over her desk, we find something essential represented, which is that while thought is undeniably a social activity, it's not continuous with social life. Thought is something that happens in a strange relation to society, at some distance from day-to-day human rhythms, in a different kind of time, attentive to different cares. The thinker is a public figure. Of that there can be no doubt, since to keep one's thoughts wholly private, unarticulated, unwritten, and unshared is to abjure the dialectical process of thought itself, the difficult translation of ideas and phenomena into language, the very fabric of sociality. Yet there remains about the thinker something private, something isolated, some quality that sets her apart. This quality is not accidental, but essential, for it is that which separates the thinker from the ideologue, the preacher, the thought leader, and the sophist. It is the quality of dedication to thought itself, a refusal to accept thought's subordination to other social values, or even to society as such. It is a willing and deliberate self-estrangement from what is known. That is, the unexamined and taken for granted premises upon which the collective imaginary structures we live within are founded. It's an effort to ask hard and perhaps unanswerable questions about our most sacred beliefs and our most obvious truths, which is why the thinker remains alienated from society even as she walks within it, and why so many people find her threatening and annoying. What is thought then? Thought is the willed suspension of thought. It is what the ancients called pondering, what Zen Buddhists call shikantaza, or just sitting, what Adorno called negative dialectics, and what German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk calls the suspension of stress semantic chains. Thought is the opposite of a hot take, which channels an emotional reaction through a pre-existing rhetorical pattern and back into the ebb and flow of social meaning. Thought is a practice which the philosophical text assists through its demand for rigorous attention to language, but which is, even as Socrates argued in Plato's Phaedrus, never reducible to the text. It cannot be replicated, reproduced, remediated, or retweeted because it's an event in a moment of social relation. Nothing more, nothing less. A pause, a suspension, a temporary liberation from the psychosomatic chains that bind us to the collective dream we call reality. So what's thinking good for, then? What's it good for today, or, frankly, ever? Why should we take the time to ponder complex and difficult arguments about abstract concerns, suspend our emotional and moral reactions to confusing and provocative claims, and cultivate alienation from the 24/7 cycle of mediated outrage and despair that shapes so much of contemporary social life? Or let's put the question another way. Over the past 30 years, hundreds of books and thousands of articles have been written about the urgent, catastrophic threat that climate change poses to the world, exploring the problem in its technical, historical, ethical, and philosophical aspects. These books and articles have been talked about in the mainstream media, even on TV, and nearly everyone who has access to the internet today knows about sea level rise, the greenhouse effect, and the melting Arctic. Yet in spite of all this intellectual work, all this research and rhetoric and effort and thought, we seem unable to act coherently and collectively to address this grave existential threat. Part of the problem is the we here, because that we includes more than 200 or almost 200 sovereign nations, each with their own political and economic agendas, various corporate entities whose very existence depends on perpetuating the extractive fossil-fueled capitalist economy that's killing us, and an elite group of rich and powerful decision makers who believe, subconsciously, if not actively, that they will be protected from the danger by their wealth, regard flagrant waste and conspicuous consumption as markers of their status, and are deeply invested in the status quo, even if it means global apocalypse. Like an addict who tells themselves they're never going to do it again, then does it, and rationalizes their behavior by telling themselves, next time, we seem to be living out a compulsive disjunction between thought and action, between reflection and the choices we make. And climate change is only the most egregious example. Think about our inadequate gun laws, the appalling regularity of school shootings, and the innumerable think pieces, personal essays, and legislative proposals that have been impotently put forth addressing the problem. Think about the outrageous persistence of systemic and ideological racism, founded in a notion of human difference thoroughly discredited by science more than a century ago, fought against by brave people who risked their lives for basic dignity and justice, and argued against by some of America's most rhetorically brilliant thinkers. Think about the ongoing stupidity of our war in Afghanistan, the stubborn persistence of aggressive sexism, our soul-sucking addiction to our phones, the rise of Trumpism, the opioid epidemic, and the less well-recognized epidemic of dependence on psychoactive pharmaceuticals for basic mental equilibrium, etc., etc., etc. If you take all the seemingly intractable ills of modern life and compare them against the vigorous, dedicated, earnest efforts made by countless talented and educated thinkers, writers, journalists, policy wonks, scholars, students, activists, and artists to address them, you might be forgiven if the conclusion you come to is one of puzzled despair. We seem incapable of listening to reason. In the late 18th century, Immanuel Kant articulated an ideal of collective, self-conscious, rational self-determination that remains one of the noblest achievements of human thought. In his famous essay, What is Enlightenment?, written in the years between the signing of the American Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution, Kant argued that free thought leads to better government. Writing, free thought gradually acts upon the mind of the people, and they gradually become more capable of acting in freedom. Eventually, the government is also influenced by this free thought, and there it treats man, who is now more than a machine, according to his dignity. It's a beautiful concept. The idea that we can all come together as equals and, through the free use of our reason and open discussion, not only decide what is best for us as a group and how to live together, but also achieve the highest fulfillment of our personal and collective existence. This concept undergirds our idea of the public sphere, what some call the marketplace of ideas, the value we ostensibly place on public education and higher education, our notions of citizenship, American civic religion, and the root of what we understand thinking, reason, writing to be good for. Thinking is good, we tend to assume, because it helps us make life better. Thinking is good, we tend to believe, because it makes us free. Yet everywhere we look today, from Twitter to the White House to Raqqa to the melting Arctic, human reason stands defeated. Our seemingly rational decisions turn out to have fatal consequences never anticipated. Free and informed public discourse has given way to propaganda, lies, harassment, and censorship, and many free citizens of open democracies no longer see the value in making judgments based on evidence, but rather seek evidence only to confirm their pre-existing judgments, heedless of whether they are accurate or erroneous. Pizzagate? P-tape? Russian hackers? Vaccines? Who knows? Trust no one. Kant's motto for the Enlightenment was sapere aude, dare to know. The motto for 21st century America seems taken from the Weird Al Yankovic song, Dare to be Stupid. And from a certain point of view, it's not wholly irrational to choose to be irrational. After all, the Enlightenment agenda of rational control over the human and non-human world is exactly what has led to most of our modern ills, from the hectic, taylorized grind of our spiritually empty lives, relieved only by binge-watching Netflix, to our dependence on pills to stave off depression, from climate change, mass extinction, and an increasingly toxic and degraded environment to nuclear war. What's more, as Friedrich Nietzsche realized in the late 19th century, radically free thought leads ultimately not to an increase in human dignity, as Kant argued, but to nihilism and apocalyptic violence. Philosophy has struggled from the beginning to make sense of the Enlightenment's internal contradictions, and those contradictions have only grown. In the words of Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, written during World War II but holding just as true today as then, the wholly enlightened earth is radiant with triumphant calamity. Alas, the Enlightenment's humanistic ideal, as beautiful as it was also a delusion from the beginning. Premised on a deliberate misapprehension of empiricism that built a giant loophole into what otherwise seems to be a wholly deterministic universe. The great problem empiricism poses, articulated variously by Hume, Spinoza, Lamettrie, and others, is that once you accept the underlying premise that the universe in which we live operates by predictable mechanisms, or laws, which can be quantified and modeled, you lose any basis for free will. A truly deterministic universe is turtles all the way down, and there's no justified exception for human consciousness. The best one can do with any kind of intellectual integrity is maintain a faith in generative chaos, the unpredictable swerve that Lucretius called the clinamen and Hannah Arendt natality, or bracket the question of whether free will actually exists at all and assert that we should believe in it anyway, because it makes us more ethical or whatever. Neither of which, generative chaos or a pragmatist will to believe, comes close, you'll notice, to anything like our actual experience of freedom, which, when you pay attention to it, looks less like reason and more like rationalization. Kant, following Descartes, dispensed with the problem by a clever bit of sophistry and an abiding faith in a Christian God. Reason offered Kant an escape from determinism because he held that reason comes from God, connects to God, in some way is God. The Enlightenment wasn't so much the triumph of reason as the subordination of scientific empiricism to Christian metaphysics. Freedom, it turns out, is the whole problem. On the one hand, the conceit necessary to make sense of a moral order structured by a choice between eternal reward and eternal punishment, and on the other, the idea that conscious control over nature, from the outward conquest of the farthest reaches of earth and space to the zealous inward self-denying asceticism of the Protestant believer, can free us from nature's limits and dictates. Freedom to choose sin or virtue on the one hand, and freedom from nature on the other. It is a conception of freedom founded not only in Christian metaphysics, but in the material history of modern Europe, namely a staggering influx of wealth plundered from the Americas and Asia, human slavery, and an industrial revolution that opened up vast reserves of solar energy stored in the form of fossilized carbon, first coal, then oil. From the beginning, our modern sense of being free meant not being a slave, whether slave to a plantation master or slave to natural powers like wind and water. Indeed, as Andreas Malm painstakingly shows in his book Fossil Capital, coal won out over wind and water as a power source for early industrialization in Britain, not because it was cheaper, but because it gave factory owners more control over their workers. That is to say, more freedom. If we're honest with ourselves and take a broad enough historical view, we must humbly submit that thought has never actually really been all that good for all that much. It's never been especially useful. Sure, there's invention and law and utopian ideals and so on, which have provided designs and justifications for innumerable human artifacts, institutions, and projects. But thought isn't engineering, despite Marx's famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach, which contends that philosophers have only interpreted the world while the point is to change it. On the contrary, thought resists instrumentalization because it resists subordination to all social value. Thought is good for thought. It is its own end. Socrates didn't save Athens. The Buddha didn't save India. Walter Benjamin didn't save the Jews. And philosophy has never cured a disease or conquered a country or rescued a village or raised a child. It might help you become more compassionate, though that didn't seem to work for Arthur Schopenhauer, who's perhaps better known for shoving his landlady down the stairs than he is for his magnum opus, The World is Will and Representation. It might help you be more prudent, though, then again, the biographies of well-known philosophers from Mary Wollstonecraft to Ludwig Wittgenstein suggest that this is not necessarily the case. Since thought has never been able to save us in the past, it might be a little unreasonable to expect it to do so now. Thought simply cannot solve the root problems of human existence, desire, mortality. And thought cannot tell us what is good, what we ought to do, or how to live, in part because these answers have no final answers. Thought cannot make us free from nature or from each other, since human consciousness is determined by countless factors, from gut bacteria to neurochemistry to genetics to acculturation to the weather. And human politics is the product of situational negotiation within social power relations, not logical propositions. And thought cannot make us gods. It can't free us from our animal material existences, the demands of embodied life, and the fact of our finitude. As long as human spirit inheres in matter, even if that spirit is a cloud stored on a server farm in Iowa, we remain mortal, dependent on the earth, and subject to physical forces which exceed human control. This is what thought truly struggles with, not the possibility of escape, but the inevitability of death. Only by coming to terms with this conundrum do we realize, at last, that the worm gets one more turn. Thought is, in the end, the only thing that can save us. Here we each stand or sit, one primate among billions in a species that has overrun and ruined its habitat, headed for a population correction the likes of which the human world has never seen, on a wobbly, spinning rock with a rapidly warming atmosphere in a distant corner of the galaxy, a temporary accumulation of stardust, was nothing, will be nothing, is nothing now, but electrochemical pulse and biological striving, a flicker in the web of being. Only thought can help us see who we are, know who we are, and help us reconcile our imaginary collective models of the world, so rich and so vital and so often false, with the truth of our worldly being. Only humble and diligent thought, uncomfortably estranged from daily life, can bring to light our total dependence on other humans and the non-human world, while opening the way to the joyful communion that dependence makes possible. True freedom emerges not from domination or even from escaping domination, but from recognizing and accepting those forces which shape our lives, cultivating detachment and interrupting the cycles of reaction and desire. Thought slows being, suspends our participation in social life, opens a gap between cause and effect that is, in the end, our only true sovereignty. The thinker, that is to say, is an interrupter, not merely a node or an amplifier within social circuits, but a place of stillness, an active pause, a total ecstatic absorption in the now. What is thinking good for today? Among the millions of voices shouting to be heard as we stumble and trip toward our doom. Not much, maybe nothing, maybe less. Certainly, memory can help preserve the wisdom of the past and set the record straight. Understanding can help us see our situation more clearly, and the two together can help us make sense of how we got to where we are. Questioning our accepted beliefs can reveal to us our hidden selves. Cultivating an awareness of our dependence on others, human and non-human alike, opens the way to compassion, humility, and the joyful communion with all being. Meditation can vitiate desire and accommodate our souls to death. And finally, ultimately, deliberation slows and limits action. Pondering our situation keeps us from reacting to it, which is, in the end, the highest good thought can offer. Doing less, doing nothing, being nothing more or less than we are. A gathering of light and dust at one with the universe. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for continued conversation with Roy.
Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to say, I'm with electronic media. If you guys wanted to ask questions like in previous lectures before, please come up to this wireless mic over here on the stand so that people in the record can hear.
Are there people with the overall?
I think so.
I feel like
There's usually a couple of people because once it gets started.
fair enough.
So I know I must have said some shit that somebody disagreed with. technology.
Yeah, I'll just ask my question. That's fine.
Okay.
I'm curious what you think that, so when talking about climate change and ecological problems, there's sort of two schools of thought that we need to actively take action, and then I've read some stuff recently from people who are saying we just need to sort of step back and let the world do its business, I guess. I'm kind of curious where you fall. I don't know if that makes sense the way I asked that, but.
Right. So I think it depends on what you mean by stepping back and letting the world do its business.
Well, I guess more simply, what do you think the proper response is? Obviously this is your view, I'm not asking for
Yeah.
an answer.
Yeah. Right. So I'm going to talk about that more fully tonight, I think. Talking about climate change and global warming and what we're looking at over the next 20 to 100 years is difficult. First of all, because I don't believe that, I think it's too late. Actually, I think it's already too late for us to stop it. And it might even be too late for us to seriously mitigate. There's just too much carbon arity in the system, too much carbon dioxide arity in the system. It's with the way that the Arctic is melting down, it's possible that we've already gone over the so-called tipping point into a self-perpetuating greenhouse dynamic that is going to just spiral out of control. So on the one hand, I argue in Learning to Die in the Anthropocene that what we really need to do is confront that fact and really sit with, first of all, the idea of our own death individually, and then the idea of civilizational death, civilizational collapse. We need to really understand that and accept it, because whatever happens in the future, this way of life is not sustainable. It's not going to keep going. Even if we were somehow to go off, to quit burning oil and coal and gasoline full sail right now, if we completely transformed the global economy, right, that's still a radical transformation of the way we live. And so even in the best case scenario, leaving out sort of miraculous technological innovations like carbon scrubbers that would just suck all the carbon out and we could just keep doing what we're doing, which are years and years from development if they can even be developed at scale. The issues that this all is changing, and we need to sit with that, because if we don't sit with that, then what happens is we still know it's changing and it's scary, and we react out of fear. We react out of not fully processed fear and anxiety, and people then we sometimes people make decisions that are more about how do we protect us, how do we build a wall, how do we keep out other people, these sorts of, we descend into a kind of tribalist logic. We have to protect our own, rather than thinking about really sitting with the possibility of transformation and what that means. So that's the first thing. However, I still want to believe, I have, this is, again, some of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I have an 8-month-old daughter, and which kind of raises the stakes for me of committing to the doom of our world, right? I want to believe, and I have wanted to believe, that there maybe is some chance, if there's some chance for revolutionary social action, social and economic transformation now to limit global warming we can't stop it, but we can limit it perhaps, and keep the worst possibilities off the table. I want to believe that's possible, and what that would mean would be like global socialist revolution, right? So, because we need a centralized economy. The capitalist markets aren't going to solve the problem for us. We need a global government, because voluntary agreements like the Paris Treaty of a couple years ago are basically meaningless. And so, on the one hand, I would say, what do we do about climate change? Learn to die. On the other hand, I would say, socialist revolution now. So that's that's the best I got. Yeah. In terms of when you say like letting it take its course, what I think of, and I don't know if this is what you mean. I think of perhaps accelerationist thinkers and things like that, but I don't know if that's what you're referring to. And that kind of that line of thought I find kind of, frankly, terrifying in its willful blindness toward the limit conditions of human existence, and in the utopian hope, in the fantastic, the fantasies, right, that it develops out of technological possibility. And we can talk more about that later, but I'm going to sort of bring that to a close now. So if you happen to be asking about accelerationists, that's sort of what I think about that, but we can talk more about it anyway.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering, so you talked a lot about thought, but I actually wanted you to talk a little bit more about distinguishing between opinion and knowledge. I was getting a little confused when you at first said that thought is an end in itself, and then you were talking about what thought can do for us, and then saying that help us be really present, absorption in the now.
Yeah.
So that seems like no thought to me, but thought can get us there. So that's kind of, I was wondering like about, and then also thought can be self-referencing and cause a lot of issues in society. So I was wondering if you could differentiate a little bit.
Right. So that's a wonderful question. And my terms are. There are some terms I use somewhat interchangeably, reason, thought, sort of back and forth a little bit sometimes, and thought versus opinion. Well, what I conceive thought to be in the way that I'm talking about it, which I don't just mean words that pop into our head, and I don't just mean necessarily philosophical arguments. What I'm trying to get at is something more evanescent, and maybe rarer, which is a kind of possibility, a space of possibility for human consciousness, right? Where we're not just, if you'll excuse the slippage in the terms, we're not just having thoughts we've had before, or we're not just having thoughts other people had before, right? We're not just thinking the same things that have been thought, where there's the possibility for new thought, where there's the possibility that that we come to new understandings of our relations in the world, the things we do, the words we use, the things we think. And that's why I sort of pose it as a paradox, right? That thought is the willful suspension of thought. I think I'm arguing that in its sort of highest ideal, thought is a slowing down, right? It's a suspension of the things we think we know, or the opinions we have, or our emotional and physical reactions, right? It's slowing all of that down and opening up a new space for consciousness to exist in. I realize that's a little abstract, but that's what I'm driving at. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
Hi. So I wanted to start off by going back to the thing you said about Marx's theses on Feuerbach.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me like you disagree with that in the strongest terms. It sounds like you think that the goal of philosophy is neither to interpret the world nor to change it. Is that correct?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So if the goal of the purpose of philosophy is not to change the world, and the purpose of thought is actually not to think, how can you call for a global socialist revolution?
Right. Well, so the call for globalist socialist revolution is, for me, a practical response. It's not a philosophical response to the problem of climate change. So when I offer the two, confronting the problem of global climate change, on the one hand, we need to learn to die. That is the philosophical response. On the other hand, non-philosophically, right? I think we need to have the global socialist revolution, and so there's a contradiction there in that I don't live a 24/7 philosophical existence. It kind of sounds like a nightmare in a certain way. So there's a disjunct there, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Do you have a follow-up?
Maybe I should let some other people ask some questions first. But yeah.
Great.
Hello, my question's not revolved around climate change, but it's continuation on thought.
Okay.
So there's a lot of dualism in things, so there's always there's two sides of everything, and then a lot of space in between.
Sure.
So earlier you made comments about social and isolated thought, and so I was wondering how much how can isolated thinking be dangerous? How much of it is best for you? Because in social activity thoughts, you can get used for manipulation. A lot of people could steal your work when it comes to that. And so when you are doing states of isolation for thought, I don't know if I'm using my word here, but how much isolated thought is too much?
Yeah, that's great. The question of risk is a serious one. So two things I'll say. First is that, as I tried to sort of piece out in my incomplete way, thought is a dialectical process. It's always back and forth, right? It's estranged from society, but it's within society. It's isolated, but it always has to be social at the same time, right? There has to be that kind of back and forth, that negotiation. Otherwise, if you're completely isolated and you're not articulating your thought in relation to other people, it's not really, I would argue, thought. It's a different kind of practice. You're no longer a social being, right? Hannah Arendt might say, you've become a sort of laboring human in the almost just an animal. You're not even in the social world anymore. And so thought, as I conceive it, always has to have that negotiation, right? The back and forth with sociality. But on the question of risk, thought is always in danger, because thought is always an opening, right? It's a vulnerability to transformation. It's a vulnerability to other people, and it's a vulnerability to self-discovery. Like in the isolated, in that dialectic, in the moments of isolation, one may find things out about oneself that one didn't want to know, or that one didn't want or that one doesn't want to believe, and that's always a possibility with thought.
Where does the value of a lone genius come from? Like, if it's not, if it's like best to be in a social environment to further your pondering thoughts,
Yeah.
where does that?
Well, I think so. The lone genius question. I think there's a kind of romantic story that we have about the lone genius, and it's wrapped up in ideas of in a valorization of the individual that's been a part of modern Enlightenment and capitalist culture, that really only tells half the story, right? Because the lone genius is never truly alone, right? They're always, whoever you think of, like, Kierkegaard or Simone Weil or James Baldwin or whoever, like, they're always enmeshed in sociality, and they're always engaged in social life, and they're always, that one uses language at all, right, means you're participating in social life, because language is the very fabric of our social being. And so, the question of the lone genius is for me properly a question of how we understand these moments or these embodiments of human life, right? Not so much the individual, but like how that individual is part of a collective.
And my final question, do you
Okay.
think there's a difference between a call to adventure and a call to isolation?
Okay. I think, yes. So I think, although they may relate to each other, or one may appear in the guise of the other, it depends on what you mean by adventure. But what's that?
Hero's journey, if you say, where
Yeah.
you encounter
Well,
several beings along your way.
Yeah,
and
right. And I guess, when you put it that way, I would refer back to, what I was saying about how thought is always in danger, right? Thought is always at risk, and you put yourself at risk because it's an opening to encounter oneself, another, things you had never imagined. So in that sense, I would say that perhaps, in a kind of dialectical sense, that there is no difference then. Thanks. These are great questions.
I'm wondering about when you learning how to die in Anthropocene, if you explore how we market youth and market in the now, and we avoid thinking about death. We're always trying to sell youth, and you're saying thought is a moment in the now. I guess what I'm getting from you is that just being in the now isn't necessarily effective, but we're selling now constantly, and thoughts are being shared in the now, and they exist only then, and they can't really move through time.
Yeah, no, that's you bring out a challenging paradox and confusion and difficulty in our contemporary culture. And you're precisely right that there is a a kind of, it seems sometimes absurd and self-destructive concern for the now, for the for what's happening now. A sense that the past is disposable and the future isn't, that we don't need to think about the future in the long term, that it's really just the short term that we're concerned with. And that isn't what I mean. It's not what I mean by the sort of the ecstatic absorption in the now. Because it's operating at this other level of consciousness. And I guess the distinction I would make is that the now that I'm talking about, and the absorption in the now that I'm talking about, is a suspension of action. It's a suspension of being. It's a suspension of thought. It's slowing into a kind of rigorous attention to the moment. Whereas the now of capitalism is a now of reaction. It's a now of satisfy your desire. It's a now of get yours. It's a now of make it happen. It's a now of have the cool thing, or it's a now of be young and alive and party, right? It's not. It's a now that's about fulfilling desire, now, right? Whereas the now I'm talking about is the now of detaching from that desire and learning to let it happen, learning to watch it happen without having to act on it. So I guess that's the strongest distinction I can make between my now and capitalism's now, is that capitalism's now is a demand that you act in the now, and that you satisfy your desire. There's more I could say on that, but does that answer your question?
Because I feel somewhat a call for action, but also a call to sit and think. And I'm wondering, where does that action come in after the now? Are we supposed to be saying that we sit and really try to consider everything, or we try to work, because we need to move into action if we want to take care of anyone around us?
Right. And this goes back to that idea of that kind of dialectical relation. Again, you can't, or maybe some people, maybe you could philosophize all day. You could meditate all day. You could sit all day and practice thinking as the suspension of thought and being, and just being. And there's a nobility in that, and there are people who can do that. Most of us, I assume you, others, we're enmeshed in the social world, and we make time if we are lucky and intentional. We make time to reflect. We make time to think. But then we also just have to do things, and so there's no hard and fast answer about when one moves from one side to the other, or when you get up from from your meditation or your thought from your desk and move into the world. But I'm arguing that first step where we take the time to stop doing things and to stop reacting is utterly necessary to make the right decisions to make wise and reflective decisions when we do move back out into our collective life. Yeah, thanks.
So your argument seems to be more about that people are denying the facts of climate change. I was wondering what your opinion of, there's a second argument that people aren't coming to the call to arms of climate change because they believe it isn't pertinent to them right now. People in the countries in power aren't really affected by what's happening with climate change. And so a lot of them are not so much denying the facts, but more of denying since it's not happening to me, so therefore I'm not going to do anything about it.
Yeah.
There's none of that motivation to be like, hey, here's all these facts, here's all of this scientific evidence and all this work that we've done, this is what's happening, and they're like, it's not happening to me, so why should I do anything?
Yeah.
Your opinion on that argument?
Right. So you're absolutely right that there are multiple forms of denial in operation when it comes to in our contemporary life, in our moment, when it comes to climate change. There's the fact denial. There's different kinds of argumentative denial. There's a kind of there's what you're talking about, which is a kind of it's not affecting me, or through my privilege or whatever I'll be able to escape it kind of denial. There's a kind of denial. There's like a techno-utopian or liberal kind of denial, presuming that somebody's going to fix it, or like that there will be a solution, that it's the institutions and world leaders who run things are going to solve the problem. And I think there's even a more insidious kind of denial that comes of a feeling of powerlessness and preoccupation with just getting through one's day. We're all busy. You've got to go to class and do your things, and and go to work, and we all have to provide for ourselves and our families and so on, and it's phenomenally difficult to stay attentive to and aware of this strange and drawn out crisis. And there's a way in which it's even if you know that it's happening and you accept that it's happening in some way, you still can't think about it all the time. And so there's a kind of denial that's just like, oh yeah, we're all screwed. All right, I'm gonna just go get a cheeseburger. You have things to do. I got things to do. And I think most of us live there. Most of us who think about climate change seriously live in that kind of denial. And I don't know, I'm not sure what to do about any of it. As I mentioned, like, scientists and journalists have been talking about climate change for 3 decades now, as a global crisis. We've known about it for a long time, and we just don't seem to be able to get it together. I don't know that there's any easy answer to that, except to just, again, sometimes I'll come back to my, on the one hand, world socialist revolution now, world socialist revolution forever, and then on the other, just like, we got to sit with that some more, you know, the fact that this is all done, and there's no escape from our own death, right, which is a condition of being born, and then there's no escape from all of this that we take for granted changing radically in ways that we can't even imagine. That's all I got. I mean, just, yeah.
So
Hi.
I feel like a lot of people have been very like hyper focused on this like stillness versus inaction, and I feel like part of like what scares people so much is the idea that like we are out of time, or before like we're running out of time. So now, are you saying that like now that we can accept death and like time is potentially like not quite as much of a factor because we're like doomed anyway, that we actually do have the time to like sit and think?
I don't, so I don't think we ever have the time. We never have the time. You know, but one of the things I often think of is some sensei, Zen teacher, somebody was like, you should meditate for 20 minutes a day, and if you don't have 20 minutes, meditate for an hour. Right? You know, there's, especially in the very driven, tailorized, the very sort of manic world we live in, the capitalist world we live in, we never have the time to think or to reflect. And it's only going to get worse as the crisis expands and intensifies. You know, the affective pressure of the crisis is that you have to act now. You have to do something now. So we'll never have the time. You know, whether it's too late or not. But we need to make the time, is what I'm sort of arguing. It's essential that we make the time.
And then I guess a slight follow-up question. Do you think like post potential like socialist revolution, global socialist revolution,
Yeah.
that will like that it will entail like a temporal shift where we like will have more time, like, or will we never have time still?
One of the really scary things about the, you know, about the future, particularly this radical transformation, however it happens, whether it's a world socialist revolution or whether it's global collapse or whether it's some other form of collective existence for human life on Earth. One of the frightening things about it is that we have no way of knowing what life on the other side of that transformation will look like. If we don't know what humans 100 years from now will need, conceptually or materially, we don't know how they'll think of time. It's really hard for us to imagine that difference, you know. that's one of the great things that, Ursula Le Guin, who just passed away, talked about in the speech she gave to the National Book Award, the National Book Awards a few years ago. Was that one of the possibilities that speculative fiction, science fiction can offer is a way to think through, other possible realities, other ways of thinking collective life. But it's all a kind of, it's not prognostication, right? It's not seeing the future. It's just imagining difference, right? And that's the best we can do now, is imagine different possibilities without having any strong assurance that any of them are going to be right. So the short answer is I don't know. Yeah, thanks.
Speaking of time,
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, great.
What do you think the relationship is between being born inside or outside of the internet, like as we know today, and the acceptance of the crisis and our imminent death?
That's such a great question that I don't know the answer to. I was born in 1976. So I guess technically I'm not a digital native, whatever. I grew up with computers, but not the way that not the way that you have. So it's hard for me even to really fully conceive of the difference in life world and consciousness that offers. So I would be reluctant to offer pronouncements, although we're still humans, and we still I still have there's still sort of my own experience to rely on, and looking at broader social phenomena. But in the end, I would say that's not something I can really speak about with authority. You're going to have to do that. You're going to have to do that thought and articulate that difference, and help your own generation and us older people, whatever, like understand what it looks like to have been born in the internet, as it were. So you'll have to tell me. Thanks. Thank you all so much for tremendous conversation and questions. That was really a joy. And thanks, Eric.